Are you wondering what a super shoe is? Will super shoes make you run faster? How many miles do super shoes last? These are all questions that many runners have. So, welcome to the Healthy Runner podcast, where we help you get stronger, run faster, and enjoy lifelong injury-free running. Today, my guest is an expert in this area in biomechanics, Dr. Matthew Moran. We are so excited to have you on the show today. Thank you very much for accepting my invite to come on to talk about super shoes.
Yeah, very happy to be here. I love the topic. I've been in the running field for quite a long time, so if I can pass along any knowledge about quote-unquote super shoes to your followers, that would be great.
Yeah, no, that I greatly appreciate that. And just to give everyone a little context in Dr. Moran's kind of background, he does hold a PhD in biomechanics. He's currently a professor in the Department of Physical Therapy and Human Movement Science while serving as director of the undergraduate exercise science program at Sacred Heart University. His primary research interests focus on investigating factors that influence human movement patterns, primarily running biomechanics. And coupled with his academic and research pursuits, he's an accomplished distance runner himself. He's a former collegiate cross-country track and field coach, and he is also coach and founder of Run Tricks, which is an online training program that offers personalized training plans and coaching for races. So, Matt, I always like to start with a little dynamic warm-up like we would before a run. I just kind of gave your formal background there, but if you could just share with our audience, where do you call home, and give us a little more backstory on how you've really gotten to this point in your career journey.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for that introduction. So I call home near you, near Quinnipiac Air Base, actually in Brantford, Connecticut. So stumbled on here haphazardly, but running was really the reason I ended up here. My wife dragged me out here to look at some homes, and we went downtown, and I saw a great running store and a great coffee shop next door. And I said, all right, this is a good location. So it ends up having some good running locations as well. So I enjoy living here on the shoreline. I actually grew up directly across the Long Island Sound on the north shore of Long Island. So,
okay. What town?
I grew up in a small town called Rocky Point. So,
okay.
So it's literally directly across the Sound. So all the same radio stations that I heard growing up, but I had never been here previously. So a lot of similarities, but some differences. But yeah, I've enjoyed living here over the last, 15 years. Prior to that, I was sort of bounced around through my collegiate years, but I got my undergraduate at College William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. And then I spent some time on Long Island teaching and coaching before I went back to get my doctorate in biomechanics at Penn State. Spent some time upstate New York in SUNY Cortland, which is, for your podcast listeners, if you're familiar with coaching, I replaced a guy named Jack Daniels, who is actually, Runner's World has dubbed the world's, greatest coach ever.
Right.
So I got to follow in Jack Daniels' footsteps. I'm not sure many coaches want to do that. So, but that was a great experience because he ended up being actually a mentor to me during my 3 years that I was at SUNY Cortland. And then I came to the Sacred Heart post. So, that's sort of where I'm at now and sort of my brief story.
Wow, that is phenomenal. Yeah, to be mentored by the king himself, Jack Daniels, that's pretty interesting. And yeah, you and I both have some Long Island roots and similarities. I grew up in Bayshore area.
South Shore,
so, yeah, South Shore. So Long Island guys getting off the island. Too much traffic, right?
There is a lot of traffic, that's for sure. Yeah.
As far as your running journey personally, do you mind just sharing I mentioned, did you yourself run in college?
Yeah. So yeah, okay. I've really come full circle with my running. So I've got to see it from all different perspectives. But, growing up that, if I had to identify myself as anything, it would have been a runner. I mean, that was my passion. I devoted all of my energies and time into that. I come from a family of runners. My dad was a 400-meter runner, and he was a high school coach. He was a great coach. So it was always just, I was always at cross-country meets. So, following in the footsteps of my brother and my father was sort of a natural for me. So, and I happened to grow up in a spot where we had 5,000 acres of a state preserve. So within a quarter mile, I was sort of lost in a sea of pine trees in the Pine Barrens of Long Island. So
Yeah.
my formative youth was spent on those trails. So it was a great experience and it led to just a love of running. And I was very inquisitive as a scientific mind. I always wanted to understand, what I needed to do to get better. So through that journey, I ended up at the College of William and Mary. So I had an up and down collegiate career with many different coaches. It ended up being successful in the long run, but it took a lot of trials and tribulations. And I continued running post collegiately and did a few marathons. But then when I was around 36, I had a significant knee injury. I had a microfracture surgery and meniscal repair,
Oh, wow.
which I don't know. I would largely say it was unsuccessful. However, it really forced me to step away from the sport. I actually thought I would never be able to run again. I did try to run after that. So then, I don't know if it was a miracle, but some level of resiliency that I just started running a little bit. Didn't really tell anybody in my basement because I didn't want to, raise expectations for myself. But I'm at a place now where I found a program that works for me, so I run strictly for a health and fitness standpoint now, and I run in a different pattern than I used to run. I don't run any races just because that's not really my motivation. I'll do workouts because I enjoy pushing myself. So I think I come at running now from a holistic standpoint because, having been a very competitive runner at a high level, but now losing the ability to run for a time period and now regaining the ability to run and approaching it from a health and fitness standpoint, I think has given me a better understanding of runners across the spectrum, as opposed to when I was coaching collegiately. I just really had a better perspective of probably more elite runners or more serious runners.
Yeah, and I think, most of our audience too, I would say probably, I don't know, I would say half perhaps, definitely like challenge ourselves as adults. And, for those a lot of times that we're athletes in other sports, running is a great way that we can kind of challenge ourselves, be somewhat competitive. But I think, even those runners still love just, I like to call like just mental clearing miles, right? Like just being able to get outside, alleviate some of your stress, your worries. It just helps keep us grounded. And yeah, it sounds like you're really enjoying that aspect of like the health and wellness aspect of running, as opposed to the, highly competitive background that you did come from. So thank you for sharing that. And, as we get into this topic, this has been definitely an evolving topic, even, if you think about it within the last 5 years. And, I didn't even start using the term super shoe, I would say, maybe like 2 years ago was the earliest I ever used that term. We were calling all these shoes kind of carbon plated shoes initially. In your mind, if we just had to define, if someone's kind of tuning into this for the first time, or they maybe even heard the term carbon plated shoes, super shoes, what is considered a super shoe?
Yeah, it's a good question. There's really three characteristics that would define a super shoe. One is the type of foam that's used in the midsole, and also the what we call a stack height, the amount of foam that's there. The second feature is actually the geometry or the shaping of that midsole. And then the third feature is, in fact, the carbon plate, which most people align with a super shoe. So those are the three features that you would naturally say are constituents of the super shoe category. Within those three design variables, there's great variance. So, as you mentioned a few years ago, there was really sort of one player in this game, that was Nike, right? So as time has evolved, and that category has opened up to different brands, we've seen deviations in the type of foam, the geometry of the foam, and then also in the carbon fiber. So we see a broad spectrum, much like we would see in the maximalist shoe division, right? So Hoka really kick-started the maximalist, but now we see maximalist shoes of all variations from most of the brands. The one feature that is not necessarily deemed unique to a super shoe, but it's typically part of a super shoe, is the mass of the shoe. It's typically a lighter mass shoe because super shoes would be more commonly used for racing purposes, although they don't necessarily have to be. So again, those are the three major constituents of a super shoe.
Right. And yeah, I would say that's the the draw and the popularity, right, that they've obtained, seeing all the elite runners at all the major, marathons out there wearing these super shoes, getting these fast times. And then, that trickles down into the general public. And I think now a lot of recreational runners, or, competitive adult runners, as I like to call, some of us,
Yeah.
we want to try to get any edge possible. And I think you did a great job kind of describing those really three variables of, the carbon plate, the actual foam that's used, and the technology that's improved with that aspect, but then the geometry. And I actually have one of my shoes right here. This is the Saucony Elite. And I think this is like a good description for those who are watching the video version of this on YouTube, of the geometry of how, it almost comes upward in the end point to kind of facilitate that, propulsion going forward. So if you're wondering, and, stack height, as Dr. Moran's talking about, is just, the thickness in that foam and how far you are off the ground. But yeah, there's so many brands now. And even I just listened to an episode this morning myself on, some even new brands I never even heard of are just like getting into this market with super shoes. But all the major, shoe brands now have their own version of a super shoe. And I guess kind of the $1 million question, right? And most runners want to know is, how much faster do super shoes make you as a runner?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say it's pretty convincing from the evidence that they will, in fact, make you faster. It would depend on the race distance, but the longer the race distance, the half marathon, you would definitely see more of a time improvement from a physiological standpoint. So when we look at the studies that have been performed, they've done what's called running economy studies. And running economy studies, you can really just think about as your gas mileage, right? So how economical, how can you best utilize oxygen to drive your aerobic system within running? And those studies on average, and these are significant findings, and you probably can find this, are hover around 4%. So a 4% on average would be the improvement of your gas mileage. As that equates to actual improvement of a race time, race performance is going to be a little bit different. It would be slightly less than that. So you would say probably between 2 and 3% would be on average in terms of the improvements you could see with your potential race time. There's a huge caveat with that. What we find with all running shoe design is individual response. We see this across really all scientific endeavors with regards to intervention studies or training studies, in that we focus quite a bit on group means because that's what researchers do, right? We want to see group means and find statistical differences between them. But you really need to get into the details and the weeds and think about, what are the individual responses? So what we've found with super shoes is that there tend to be responders, high responders, and low responders. So it's possible that one of your podcast listeners might be a high responder to a particular type of super shoe, and that would give them an even enhanced race improvement. So maybe that 2 to 3% race might be 4 or 5% race improvement for that particular runner. When we get into some of the naysayers about super shoes in terms of sort of ruining the sport, which there are some that say that, is because of this effect of individual responders. Now it's the technology that's benefiting one runner potentially more than another runner. So, but in general, I would say from a race performance standpoint, 2 to 3% is probably if you're just trying to do some math on your marathon time, you could probably use that as your estimate.
Okay. Yeah. And it's definitely helpful. And has there been, because I know there was like the initial study that was done, has there been other studies that have replicated some of that initial work?
Yeah, they're continuing all
okay.
the time. Yeah, actually the lab that's probably the leader in that is at UMass Amherst. They do the most studies regarding this. They have some good industry funding, so they're able to get these shoes. So the initial studies, they were just trying to quantify sort of what were the running economy improvements. Subsequent studies have then sought to understand, where do these improvements come from? Is it the foam? Is it the carbon fiber? Is it the geometry? Does foot strike matter? Does mass of the runner matter? Obviously, the heavier the runner, the more they'll compress the midsole. Males versus females. So they've tried initial studies only focused on males. More recent studies have focused on the inclusion of females. And then looking at differences of longitudinal stiffness, like basically carbon fiber, and then where the improvements come from. So they've really tried to drill down into the details of understanding why we are actually more economical with these shoes. So these studies are ongoing. Most recent publications have really focused on super spikes, which is an interesting concept. Obviously with most track races, although aerobic contributions are important, the anaerobic contributions are probably more important for success. So you can't really do running economy studies when you're trying to evaluate super spikes. So yeah, so the studies are ongoing, and my guess is they'll continue, especially as we see the variety of shoes within the market.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting, and I'm glad to hear that there is, some real research being done versus, these shoe companies just like marketing products to us, and because there are so many products out there in the running industry, and a lot of them aren't studied. So it is nice to know at least that we do have some serious labs looking at this, at these products that are being, bought by the masses within the running community. And, in your mind, who, I know you mentioned now they're starting to look at like males versus females and different body mass, but, who would benefit really from super shoes in your mind? If there's someone listening here and being like, oh, this is kind of interesting, maybe I should get a pair of super shoes. Who do you think would like benefit the most in super shoes?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think for starters, if you're a recreational competitive runner or for an adult competitive runner who is really interested in your performance and want to get faster and have that competitive urge, then I think you would benefit from it. So it doesn't matter how fast you are. If you are motivated to hit a PR, hit a personal best, to qualify for Boston, then I think the super shoe category, if you have the disposable income, makes sense for you. I mean, these aren't cheap products, but if you have the disposable income, you're passionate about the sport, and you want to run a faster time, then I think you check the three boxes to trying out super shoes. There's really no reason that you wouldn't want to. I'll talk a little bit about the potential injury risk, but I think those would be the three starters in terms of thinking about, giving these a shot. We've talked only about the racing aspects. I think, that is the obvious inclusion of super shoes within your training regimen is race day. What we're finding in elite runners is that the inclusion of super shoes in training has provided a profound influence on the training effect. So one of the key attributes of the super shoes is that they lower eccentric work. And for your listeners, what that means is really the demand of your muscles to support your skeletal system. So every time you land during running, it's essentially a controlled landing. It's what we call an eccentric event. So your muscle is actually contracting to support your skeletal system. So with the use of super shoes, it does two things. It makes that landing easier because the midsole is actually doing the catching of your body, and then it actually helps to propel you forward. There's energy return from the midsole. So the inclusion of a super shoe within training allows you to train faster without as much muscular damage, which means you can recover faster and do more of the training. I think for your listeners, if they're not at the very high end, I think they'll be thinking of on race day. So how can I use these shoes on race day to be faster? And the key thing I think they'd want to think about is just making sure they get some runs in previously so that they're comfortable with the shoes and they're not going to have some adverse effects such as blistering is a big problem if you're haven't worn a shoe before wearing it for the first time. And then you'd also want to make sure the one thing I'm concerned about with super shoes, which hasn't been studied as much, is in terms of frontal plane. So if we're thinking of the back and the rear foot and thinking of really pronation. So we do see differences in kinematics, how you run when you put the super shoes on. So those are some considerations. But to answer your initial question, I think it's those three categories. If you're really passionate, interested in your running, you want to get faster and you have disposable income, then I think you're a prime runner to give these a shot. And I will tell you, even though I do not race anymore, I have super shoes, and when I wear them for my workouts, they're amazing. Like it's a euphoric, right. It's a euphoric experience when you get to wear these, and you are able to hit times and feel different. So there is just a natural intrinsic reason for wearing these. It sort of feels fun. I tell my students in my class, it's almost like when you're at an airport and you have those people movers in the middle. When you can walk on those things, it's like, whoa, this is sort of fun. I'm zipping along.
Right.
Super shoes are sort of like that when you run. So yeah, I think if you meet those three criteria, I'd say yeah, you should give it a shot.
Wow. Okay. So yeah, you shared so many golden nuggets there. I want to try to recap all the great things I heard. And first point is when we should wear these, not only for races, but also practice in them for workouts. Right. So if you're doing any faster running, if you are adding speed work into your plan, then this is when you'd want to actually utilize them for workouts to possibly enhance recovery, is what I'm hearing from you, and not doing as much stress to your tissues. I would also argue that you're allowing your body to adapt to the demands that are different, which you also shared that biomechanically our form is going to be slightly different in a super shoe versus like a traditional run shoe. So in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, well, you got to kind of adapt to those demands, just like we do with training and running in general. But if we're going to run slightly different, then, we don't want race day to be that first time, especially if it's the marathon distance,
Correct.
right?
Yes.
So you don't want that race day to be the first time. So we have to allow our bodies to adapt to those demands. And then, yes, I can't agree more with your point in terms of the fit. And that's like the issue that I've had with many of the super shoes that I've tried, is really that fit and making sure it doesn't blister, making sure that your toe, like in all the super shoes that I have here today, that I've worn for, marathons, like the Saucony Pro 3s, if I had to do it again, and it never showed up during training, but on marathon day, my second toe was hitting the edge and I got a black toenail, right?
Yep.
So that toenail was an issue. So now I know I need to go a half size up in that shoe. The Adios Pro 3 that I wore for the Dopey Challenge, I had an issue with some of my extensor tendons on the top with the lockdown. So it's like you have to, because these are unique in the geometry, I think it's even more specific to like your foot type, and if you have a wider forefoot, if you have a narrow foot, if your heel tends to slip out, like you have to try a lot of different lacing options. Like Coach Lou on our team, also he's like, with his Nikes, he's done different lacing options. So I've seen some like irritation of extensor tendons in a lot of the clients that we work with, getting blisters or black toenails. So I couldn't agree more with these shoes, especially versus a traditional shoe, is you might run into more of those issues. So you definitely want to try them out as much as possible on not only speed work day, but I would say in marathon training on a long run, right? Like where you are out there 2.5 hours at least. Even if you're not doing speed work in your long runs, I usually like to have, my clients wear them on a 16 or an 18 miler in training, so they know, okay, I'm not going to blister in these shoes on marathon day. So some great points.
That's really great advice. I mean, the devil's always in the details. The more that you can simulate from a race perspective to a training perspective, the less chances you have for adverse effects. I mean, I have one personal story for me is I just changed a pair of socks. I ran New York City Marathon one time, did the expo. I'm very type A, had everything planned out. I did my long runs, my key long runs at the same time I was going to start. My outfit, everything was dialed in. I went through the expo to get my bib. I just bought a new pair of socks. I'm like, oh, this would be nice. I like the color, and these are nice. I put those on, and at the time I was wearing orthotics. So but what I didn't realize was that the coefficient of friction between those nice new socks and the orthotic was much less. So I felt it on the downhill coming down the Verrazano. I felt my foot slipping, and my midfoot, I'm a midfoot striker, so underneath the balls of my feet, I felt were on fire. So I was like, oh my God, I am in trouble. So I ran the race and I finished, but it was I couldn't walk for several days after the race, purely because I probably ripped through about 4 layers of skin underneath my metatarsal heads. It was the most painful experience, all from a relatively benign decision of a new pair of socks. So to your point, the more you can try things out, the better off you'll be, especially with the super shoes. The one thing to keep in mind, though, and the half-life of these shoes is not very long. So the more times you do try them out and the more times you use them, the return from the foam is going to be diminished. So keep that in the back of your mind, in terms of how often you will use these, because these will not last as long as your traditional EVA midsoles.
Yeah. So how many miles do they really last, or how many miles would you recommend a runner actually run in their race day super shoe?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the inclusion, I know you mentioned 16 to 18-mile long runs. I mean, that's certainly, you could do that. I mean, with runners that I work with, we would usually break it down into smaller chunks of wearing them, just so we can, sort of retain them. But there's no golden answer in terms of what's right or wrong. Your kinematics will change. So what we haven't published any studies with super shoes. We've done work with an old brand of shoe called a Newton, which I don't know if you've ever heard of.
I remember those. Yeah.
Yeah, we were the first study to look at differences of the Newton, but it does relate to the super shoe. But what we do now is we look at runners when they come to our lab at the Pioneer Performance Center. We do 3D gait analysis, and we look at their running form with and without their super shoes. And we do see profound differences. There's one runner in particular. He's around a 3-hour marathoner, newer runner. He put his super shoes on, and he changed from a pronounced rear foot. This is fascinating to me. A pronounced rear foot striker. So my thought was, oh, you put these super shoes on, you have this big cushiony foam that's going to make you stay a rear foot striker, or maybe even become a more pronounced rear foot striker. He changed to a midfoot striker, and it was fascinating. He had no idea he was doing this. So when you change foot strike, that obviously, to your point earlier, is going to change the soft tissue demand. So he would be someone who, it's really important that he would do longer work with his super shoes on to get the soft tissues ready to handle that load. Those type of reports haven't been reported in the peer-reviewed evidence yet, because they're really case studies or anecdotal. But I'm sure there are more of those. And to your point of the fit of these, the other thing that influences the fit and feel is the design of the carbon fiber, and it's what's known as the teeter-totter point. And I think you referenced it with the first pair that you showed. It changes where the roll-off is. So, and that changes where that push-off occurs, and so you're going to have a different feel with different super shoes based upon how they've designed that teeter-totter and what might feel best for you. So, unfortunately, for the consumer, for the end user, you can't try every pair of super shoes. There's just so many out there right now. So, you're going to get benefit from them, but it seems like you've tried a few pairs. I don't know if you've found the pair that you love right now, but they do feel differently based upon the design of them, and some will really gravitate towards more runners versus other runners. How long they last for, it's a good question. We know there's really cool microscopic evidence from EVA midsole, and you can actually see foam cell degradation very early in the process. Even within the first 75 miles, they'll lose energy return. So with these super shoes, their midsoles will last much less than that. I don't have good peer-reviewed evidence, and some of it will be foam specific, but from my own personal experiences, after 100 miles of use of these shoes, they definitely feel different, and they don't feel as responsive or snappy. So, at some point, again, there's a limit to how many of these you can go out and buy. So,
right. Right. And I would say, I think if your goal is, your A race or you're trying to PR a race, then you probably shouldn't take your super shoes that are over 100 miles. But I think I know some runners that just get really caught up in I would rather them to be like the freshest possible on race day. So they literally, have like 5 or 10 miles on them. And I think, the difference in performance that you're going to find in 10 miles versus, 50 miles, let's say, on the shoe is probably not going to be seen on race day, right? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's all risk reward. So is the reward of that, tenths of a percentage point improvement worth the risk of having something adverse go on with that shoe? blistering or too small or whatever it may be. To me, it's not worth the risk reward. So you're much better off getting more miles in, making sure you're comfortable in that shoe. Prior to all the super shoe evidence, one of the factors that dictated, or what, not dictated, but was related to performance was comfort of the shoe. So
Mm-hmm.
running comfort is just as important as actually shoe mass, which is really fascinating. So getting a shoe that feels good does matter. So yeah, I would agree with your sentiments that it's not worth the risk of having like a out of the box because and I will tell you this, there are manufacturing tolerances, and these companies use different factories to make their shoes. So it may be an identical, maybe the Vaporfly 2, same exact size, but if it was manufactured in a different facility, the tolerances will be different, and it actually may be a slightly different sizing than the previous pair that you had. So, again, devil's in the details. So I would be cautious and try to at least break that, get a little bit more accustomed to them.
Right. And yeah, my physical therapist brain always goes to, it'd be better to adapt your tissues a bit on those, faster workouts and maybe a long run, before race day versus, you possibly, have a fresher foam on race day. So, but I've personally, will take mine to in training to like 200. I've even taken a couple to 250 miles just because they still felt fine. Yeah, they had a little less pop in them, a little less bounce. But, for let's say not like my hardest speed workout in a training block, I'm like, they're doing their job. Because, like these things cost a lot of money, right? As you mentioned before. And, going to your point before about fit and comfort, that was exactly why I decided after I got the Saucony Elites that I mentioned before, I purchased these instead of the Pro 3s because they were supposed to be better, make you faster. It had a different foam in it. This foam was supposed to be a little bit better. And I did this for my goal half marathon last June, and I did have some fit issues, and it didn't, feel real comfortable. I had some forefoot pain, and I was just, questioning. I'm like, is this going to be my marathon shoe?
Yeah. Yep.
And I wound up purchasing, the Endorphin Pro 3 because I did not want to have to run a marathon and have my, forefoot killing me.
Yeah,
So,
sure.
to your point there, I got the shoe that wasn't as fast, quote unquote, or, Saucony's best shoe. And it does matter in terms of your foot type, how you run, right? Your form,
Definitely.
your running form. And so, but yeah, the cost thing is definitely a barrier for us to be able to try these. And a lot of the specialty run stores don't actually carry these in stock, right?
Yeah,
So
well,
it's not
it's
like
hard for
you
them to
can
make
go.
money. They're not going to stock up on them if they're only selling a small number of these. So it's challenging. Yeah.
Right.
One
So
of
it
the things
is
we're actually
trial and error.
starting at our Pioneer Performance Center, we have a really incredible setup for our biomechanical analysis and our physiological testing. So we will be, we're doing this now. If you have several pairs of or a couple pairs of super shoes, you're maybe deciding, and you're curious about how you run with them or which one you're metabolically more efficient in. We're doing that within our Pioneer Performance Center. So again, probably only for a few people, but it's a pretty cool thing where you'd come in and we'd go through a running economy. So you would get a clear picture in terms of which shoes you're more economical in, and also how it changes your running form. So we're excited about that. Again, we come at it from again, we care about the individual runner, and then through this process, we're trying to understand super shoes better ourselves. So yeah, we're excited about offering that.
Wow. Nice. And that's open to the general public?
Yeah, general public. Yep, absolutely.
Wow.
So yeah,
Okay.
we have a Treadmetrics treadmill, which is amazing. Gives us 3D forces under each footfall, and we have markerless motion capture. And then we'll be doing that with our Cosmed metabolic system. So our sports scientist runs all that. So it's interesting. There's you can go online and check this out with YouTube. But Molly Seidel, she didn't run the Olympic trials, but when she was preparing, she went up to Puma's Nitro Lab, and they did exactly that. They had her in a couple pairs of their prototypes versions, and they were trying to find out which one she was most efficient in. which is really
Hmm.
cool. So that was really where the idea prompted from me. I'm like, oh, this would be sort of, I could see a few runners who, just are really into running and want to know more and have maybe a couple pairs and are curious about how their body responds. So, yeah, we're excited to offer that to the general public.
All right.
So,
Well, you just
yeah,
might be seeing my name
yeah.
signing up.
All right, maybe you can do one of your podcasts. Though. You could film it.
Yeah,
So,
that'd be awesome. Yeah,
yeah.
no, I would be very interested in that. And I know, we mentioned cost there, and yeah, most of these are like 225, 250 range, right, in terms of cost.
Yeah, I mean, if you're smart, maybe get older models, or maybe sometimes you can get lucky if you're a Nike person, go into the Nike outlet. We have one near us, so sometimes you can get a little bit lucky, sort of finding one that may work for you. But yeah, generally speaking, you're probably talking about $200. But in the broad scheme of things, again, if you're passionate about running, if you're, I think the Boston Marathon's what is up to like $300 or so. So, and when you compare it to other sports like triathlon, it is it expensive? Yes, but if you love the sport, you're passionate. It is money well spent because again, we know the evidence that it will lead to improvement. So again, I don't work for any running shoe companies, but
Yeah.
if you've never tried them and you met those three criteria earlier, I think it's worth it to give it a shot.
Right. And yeah, the Adidas ones that I got actually last year were like a Black Friday special, and they were 25% off because I wasn't planning on getting a new shoe for the Dopey Challenge. But I was like, you know what? Let me try a different brand, right? Like see how it feels. And that's how I got that one. Then I just heard about, if there are any PTs listening who are members of the APTA, and I'm like so mad I didn't know about this earlier. But they APTA members get a 40% discount with Saucony,
Wow,
and
that's huge.
that goes up to 3 pairs every year. So yes, I just did order the Saucony Pro 4, 2 pairs, not 1 pair, but 2.
Yeah.
But I'm like, hey, if you save over $100 per
Yeah.
pair, like how can you not,
That's
take
great.
them up on that offer? So PTs out there who are APTA members, you're welcome. Let me know if you got in on that offer, because I thought that was amazing, and that they include their super shoes in that deal. So
yeah, good
that's a
for
little tip
good
there.
for Saucony for doing that. Kudos.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know we mentioned before using the super shoes in training. How often, let's say someone's either doing a 5 or a 6-day run plan, how many runs throughout the week would you recommend really, like someone actually train in super shoes?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously depends on the level of your runner and sort of how many high intensity sessions that they're going to be including. So I would say for me, it's really no more than one, but I'm not training for a marathon right now. So a good first inclusion for these would be on a higher intensity day when maybe you're doing tempo intervals or you're running, probably running at a faster than maintenance or regular run pace. So that would be a good inclusion to start. And that's where you can start working in some marathon specific and then half marathon specific work. If you're doing tempo intervals, I don't know if you have a lot of your runners do that, but I'm a big fan of tempo intervals because you can really dial in the pace. You don't get sort of caught out too fast, which can ruin the workout. So with those, you could actually sort of utilize sets. So if you're doing, let's say you're building up to 6 by 800, so you want to get 3 miles of sort of tempo work, you really could say, hey, first 2 we're going to do in my trainers, and then the last 4 you put on your super shoes, and you're really obviously able to go faster. So that's one easier way to do that. And again, when you're doing it in intervals, if something adverse happens or you're trying out shoes for the first time, all right, you did one interval, it doesn't feel right, you can take them off and then obviously switch shoes. So that's a good inclusion. And then moving forward, as you prep for the marathon, there's obviously going to be key long run prep runs where you're going to be building in marathon specific work for a big chunk of that. I think to your point earlier in getting your soft tissues ready, I think those are the second opportunities of the week where you'd want to, somehow include the super shoes, depending upon how you want to do it. You certainly could, if you're including, miles 12 through 17 are going to be at marathon pace, you could plan it where at mile 12 you do a quick swap of your shoes, quick drink of water, get your fuel, and then you go into your 5 mile block with the super shoes on. as opposed to doing all 17 miles on them. So, I mean, there's no right or wrong. I think we're getting into probably just coaching decisions and different ways that you might want to break it down. So those would just
Right.
be my ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, so really just anytime you are doing faster running, so if someone's doing like 1 day of speed work, whether it's tempo intervals at like threshold pace or whatever race pace that
Hmm.
they're doing, and then if they are doing some long runs, we like to call them like long runs with spice,
Yeah.
with some pace work in there, or
Yes.
long run workouts. Those would be the days. And okay,
Yeah,
perfect.
I don't see the point of really including them on the other days of the week, to be quite honest. Really the meat and potatoes, 80% of your runs are probably these meat and potato runs, which they serve a physiological purpose. They're probably between 60 and 65% of your intensity. You could definitely wear sort of a more structured shoe that has a longer, half life, so to speak. I don't think you need to use them for that. You're just going to break these shoes down. And you know, most of these super shoes, they really offer no frontal plane or pronation control or midfoot stability or limited. I haven't looked into all of them. So for runners where that may be an issue, the concern would be, to your point earlier about stressing soft tissues, they may actually stress tissues too much where they might create injury by wearing these too much and changing their mechanics. So that would be my concern with some runners. There's other runners that, quite frankly, their injury tolerance is so high they could probably wear dress shoes and never get injured. So it would really be more for the runners who've had a history of running related injuries. I would be concerned with them wearing them too much.
Right. And in our kind of framework that we talk about a lot on this podcast is kind of like 6 steps to growing as a runner. That's not just like the running, but like strength training is important, like, and the mindset's important. Nutrition, recovery is important. Is there any evidence yet out on super shoes in terms of helping recovery?
Anecdotally, absolutely. It's clear when we look at the eccentric demand, that demand will shift at the metatarsal phalangeal joints, the ankle joint. There's not great evidence at the knee, although the stuff that we've looked at in terms of kinematics, knee flexion patterns are definitely different. Namely, that you need less knee flexion. And then we see mechanical demands changing at the hip as well. So I don't know if any studies have actually looked at markers of muscle. It's challenging when we start thinking about what are the metrics we would use to assess muscle damage and muscle fatigue. However, when we think about muscle damage is invoked from eccentric demand, and if eccentric demand goes down, it's obvious then that muscle fatigue would be less. So your recovery would be better. And anecdotally, at the highest levels, this has been cited as one of the reasons that we're seeing these improvements of times across all race disciplines, is that super shoes now allow more intense running and recovery time is faster. So you just don't get beat up as much. I mean, quite frankly, than you used to in wearing shoes that really didn't provide any of that midsole, because the midsole is really doing the work for you and catching yourself from every foot strike. So yeah, so again, for the scientific evidence, it's probably limited, but lots of anecdotal evidence, and from an academic construct, it would make sense that super shoes are going to aid in creating less muscle fatigue, which then would expedite the recovery process.
And would I be correct in saying, from what you just said there, would super shoes actually take the demand off of some of the ankle structures and then maybe place a little bit more either movement or muscle function up at the hip joint?
Yeah, it changes muscle demand, so it will reduce the eccentric demand at the metatarsal phalangeal and the ankle joints, because you're getting that return from the shoe. So that means it's going to reduce the muscular demand at those. Eccentrically at the knee, it will reduce the demand of the quadriceps. So that's why we see knee flexion decrease with the super shoes. So if that's one of the reasons when you think about the Boston Marathon. The Boston Marathon is so challenging because it's downhill for the first half, and your quads get destroyed. So super shoes help in that process. And then as a result of that, they do shift soft tissue demands, and namely at the hip as well. So we see it all the way up the kinematic chain, which is really fascinating. And it really goes to the point of what you wear on your feet matters. And even at again, a scientific study standpoint, if we don't see significant changes, small kinematic changes can have profound influences on muscle stress. So, it's really, again, this has been a really interesting inclusion within the biomechanical world because, although we've always been interested in footwear, this new footwear type has really invoked quite a bit of questions and searching for answers. So I think those are ongoing in terms of fully encapsulating it. But as I mentioned earlier, some of the reasons it's getting a little more muddied now is because there's so many varieties of super shoes on the market, and then there's so many varieties of runners on the market. So that's why with our Pioneer Performance Center, we're really looking at an individual basis to start to understand some of these trends. And that hopefully would lead to a larger study in the future once we start to get a better sense for what we feel those relationships are.
Right. And just looking at it from like an injury standpoint, and a lot of the runners I work with, would I be correct in kind of making this assertion is if someone is struggling with either bunion pain, first MTP pain, Achilles tendinopathy, and maybe they have a little flare up before a race, perhaps using a super shoe would actually lessen their symptoms on a certain run. But if someone was having like high hamstring pain, proximal hamstring tendinopathy, maybe adding a super shoe into their routine may, increase some symptoms. Would that be a theoretical?
I think, yeah, absolutely. Right now, it'd all be theoretical. Adam Tenford looked at some case studies in metatarsal stress fracture and the use of carbon fiber shoes. So, again, it's challenging because what we wear on our feet matters and it changes our kinematics. So I think it's hard right now to make those direct relationships where if someone is experiencing Achilles tendonitis or if they have bunions, or then we know a super shoe is definitely going to help them versus the same with your other. So I think at this point it's probably hard to make those direct recommendations based upon an injury. But you are thinking correctly in that, those injury types will respond differently to what they wear on their feet. So it's definitely something to be cognizant of moving forward. But it would be nice if we got to the point where we understood those relationships a little bit more. But from my experience, it still remains challenging to make those relationships. The more I think I understand, the less I find out I really do.
Right.
So, we don't specifically think about, we get a lot of injured runners or formerly injured runners in the return to run process. So we do a lot of gait analyses and we look at it holistically. So, we're always thinking about footwear as one of the quivers that we can utilize when we try to help a runner moving forward. So it's always a consideration. We're not ideological, we're not anti-orthotic, we're not anti any shoe. We're really just for a solution for that runner. And footwear generally is part of that solution package. If we have a runner that's been multiple stress fractures, they have high impact loads, naturally getting them into a more cushioned shoe is theoretically makes sense. So we just try to, to your point, we try to make those connections when we make recommendations for footwear, but it is challenging. We look at it holistically. So, we'll look at their training, we'll look at their musculoskeletal package in terms of, what are you doing from a rehab standpoint that will influence running form.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because I think as runners, we tend to want the quick fix. And there are a lot of runners out there who think their injuries are caused by their shoes. And we're not even talking super shoes, right? They're just talking, changing, one different brand of like a traditional shoe. Mm-hmm. So thank you for bringing that up in terms of, there are a lot of risk factors, causative factors, and there are a lot of variables that go into healing from injuries. And even we talked about recovery before. I think every single one of us could do a better job at doing the ultimate recovery, which is sleep.
Yeah, right? Absolutely.
And it's free. And, that's going to help you the most while recovering from injury that everyone can do.
And listening to your body. I mean, I think the thing, especially with, most of the driven runners are type A, they want to get better and they just feel missing that run is going to be problematic, or not hitting mileage. I got to squeeze my mileage in. I went away, I got sick. I want to get my mileage back in. what I see, and this is on the Run Trick side, I've worked with 50,000 runners, and most of them fall in this recreational, competitive sort of category. And especially what I see with aging runners when they get to late 40s, 50s, and 60s is that there's an unwillingness to want to modify training. And namely rest and thinking about, hey, is there a different way for me to get to this end goal? So I think the biggest thing runners need to keep in mind is that there is no one pathway to getting that personal best. And in fact, if you're unwilling to vary as you age as a runner, you're likely going to run into problems. So finding different ways to be successful, namely through the use of recovery, use of cross training, definitely getting on soft surfaces. So I think being more open to that as a runner is going to lead to greater longevity and also greater racing times. And I've seen that personally. I know sort of the confines of what I can run, and if I exceed them now, I know I'm going to have problems. And this is from someone who, I was a 7-day-a-week guy. I was a guy who needed to get my mileage. Now, as I age, getting closer to 50, I understand the importance of recovery and finding different ways to get to that end goal. And I think sometimes with runners that are aging, they're not willing to make those modifications, or they think it's going to hurt them. So listening to your body, I think, is as important as sleep.
Absolutely, yeah. That information is gold. Honestly, that's just fantastic. So many people have heard me talk about those things. So it's nice to hear you speak about them in a different way. So hopefully that message is really resonating for our audience here. And, the final stretch, this is like the last question that we ask all our guests. If you could change one thing about the misconception of super shoes with running, what would that be?
I think the biggest misconception is it's the carbon fiber that is leading to the improvements. So a lot of people, it's the carbon fiber, right? Because it has this like high tech allure to it. You think of it as this sort of energy producing sort of spring in the shoe, and the evidence doesn't support that. It's the foam. The foam is the magic. The carbon fiber, adds to it, but they've actually looked at, and this is really fascinating, they looked at the same exact shoe, one where they got rid of the stiffness of the carbon fiber, and the other where they retained it. And what they found from that is the carbon fiber is only producing about 1% of the 4% metabolic saving. So I think the biggest misconception is it's the carbon fiber. The carbon fiber will help to give some stability, will give it lightweight stability to that foam, because otherwise the foam, and I've run in a pair of prototypes from New Balance that didn't have the carbon fiber. They're really wishy-washy. Like you just don't feel like you have the stability. So the carbon fiber adds the stability, and the carbon fiber will change the feel. Because of that, I mentioned earlier that teeter-totter. So I think the biggest misconception is that it's the carbon fiber, when in fact the real magic is in the foam and the design of the foam.
Nice. Yeah. And that foam is to make things more lightweight, and the lighter the shoe, right? We should be able to run faster, but then the carbon fiber plate provides that stability that the foam needs, because it would just crumble underneath. So excellent. So just to recap, what we had talked about today, what you guys all learned about super shoes from Dr. Moran. This has been very informative, fascinating. We talked about what's considered super shoe. We talked about those three elements of the foam, the carbon plate, and the geometry of the shoe. We talked about, yes, they do actually, and studies show, and they continue to show, they will make you faster or more economical. So you're going to be more efficient as a runner, and theoretically, if you could be more efficient for a long duration of a race, it's like what we talk about in our race strategy is trying to, prevent yourself from going out too fast, right? You want to maintain energy, so then you have it at the end, so you can run a faster time. We talked about who would benefit from super shoes, and it sounds like, a lot of runners may benefit from super shoes, but those especially looking for a PR or looking to run faster,
sure,
or doing specific speed work. We talked about when we should wear super shoes, of kind of more of our training speed work days that we're running faster than easy pace. We also talked about these don't last forever, and there is a mileage cap, and we talked about adapting to the super shoes, talked about all those negative consequences that can occur perhaps, depending upon the type of runner that you are. And we talked about some of that recovery as well. So this has been super informative. Dr.
Yeah,
Moran,
that's great.
I appreciate you sharing all your knowledge and wisdom. What else would you like to add?
Yeah, the one thing I probably should have mentioned is even if you're not a half marathon, a marathoner, and you're listening to this, I mean, you would see improvements at a 10K. If you go to a Division One, Division Two, or Division Three collegiate 10K race on the track, the majority of those kids are going to be wearing probably Nike Vaporflies, right? So you see high level elite runners even at the 10K distance wearing these shoes. So if you're listening and you're like, I'm not a half marathon, I'm not a marathoner, but you meet those three criteria I talked about earlier, you would see benefit out of 10K as well. And again, you'll definitely have some enjoyment wearing them. So hopefully you guys got something out of this. Thanks for having me on, Duane. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that point up as well. And yeah, where can our Healthy Runner community connect with you if they're interested in learning more about what you're up to from like research standpoint or on the Run Trick side?
Yeah, so from a research clinical standpoint, we do our work at the Pioneer Performance Center. So we have a 4,400 square foot facility at Sacred Heart University. It's really amazing. We've continued to expand it. We have a full-time sports scientist who is an accomplished runner and coach himself. He's really our guru for lactate testing, metabolic testing, and we're excited about, in our opinion, building one of the best comprehensive run lab testing facilities in New England. So we think we're well on our way to getting there, and we look at runners holistically. So we do work with a lot of runners that are sort of injured or coming off injury, and we're passionate about it. We look at all aspects of it. So from a clinical, and we do run research studies from time to time. So if you reach out, there's probably possibilities for you to be included. Obviously, that's free of charge, and you would gain intrinsically from what we would be testing. On the Run Trick side, that's obviously run coaching. So if you're interested in that, you can go to runtricks.com, and those are geared towards 10Ks, half marathons, and marathons. But so best of luck with your running journeys. It's up here in New England. This is like prime time to get out for some nice runs. So.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. This has been very informative. I appreciate you taking your time, Matt. Thank you for coming on the show. And thank you to the listener. If you heard this during a run, your commute into work, or you're watching the video version on the Spark Healthy Runner YouTube channel, greatly appreciate you tuning in. And if you found this helpful, copy the link wherever you're listening to it, share it with a running buddy of yours who wants to learn more about super shoes. Happy running. And as always, let's maintain a strong mind, a strong body, and let's just keep on running. Until next time.